Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, where we see the Word. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each have their own big idea. Matthew's going to present Jesus as the King of the Jews. Mark presents him as the servant of God. These aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. Luke presents Jesus as the Savior and storyteller. Remember, it's in Luke's account that you have all those big story parables. John, from the very beginning, is going to present Jesus as the Son of God. That phrase "Son of God" is going to be seen in all four Gospels, but in John, it's the big idea. In Matthew, it's written primarily to a Jewish audience. In fact, there's an old tradition that has it that Matthew originally wrote in Hebrew. I don't know if that's true, but that's a very old tradition. Mark seems to have a Latin audience, a Roman audience in view. Luke addresses his gospel account to somebody with a Greek name, but it seems again to be both a Greek and Roman audience. But John seems to write to everybody: Jews, Gentiles, the world is the audience. So what we're going to see in John's prologue, and I'm going to break this into three parts, and then we'll see a more detailed outline when we come to the end. Um, the first section, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, we're going to see the Word introduced, both in eternity and among men, and then we'll focus in on the Word in history and among the Jews in particular, and then we'll focus even further in the Word in history and among believers, how it impacts you and I. Let's jump in. Chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word. Now, notice the way he begins. That's not the only book of the Bible that begins that way. In the beginning takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where the Tanakh, the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, start with the same line. It was recognizable. If I started a piece saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, you would know that I borrowed that from an earlier piece of literature. It's a historic beginning, and this is a historic beginning. It's taking us all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But notice how it does that. It doesn't say in the beginning God did something, or in the beginning something happened, but rather in the beginning was the Word. It was already there. And that use of that's called the imperfect tense in the Greek, that continual action in the past. In the beginning, something was already there. So we see in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So notice three statements, actually four, because in verse 2, I like the way the King James presents it a little bit different. This same one, or this one, was in the beginning with God. I think that works a little bit better. You haven't found out yet that it's a he. We're going to find that out when we get to verse 14. Verse 14 is going to say, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So when we get to verse 14, it's going to be very clear we're speaking of Jesus. But we're not there yet. And so that's jumping the gun. Let's look at this verse without the benefit of verse 14. We'll bring that into play. But in the beginning was the Word. And when you said that just by itself, if you were a Greek reader, you have this idea that had been presented by the Greek philosopher Plato a few hundred years earlier of the logos, that's the Greek word for word, which was the divine reason, and it brings order and logic into the universe, into the cosmos. And that was a very Greek philosophical idea that had caught on and was still around by the time John is writing his gospel account. But if you said that to a Jewish reader, he's going to have a very different idea. He's going to hear God's vocal manifestation. God speaks, and it happened. His voice that spoke the world into existence. And so, if it's a Greek reader, he's going to say to his Jewish friend, "Hey, look at that! He really connects with us in our philosophical thinking." And the Jewish reader says, "Well, no, there's something beyond that. This is the God of the Old Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and this is His manifestation." And they're both going to see something different, and in a sense, they're both right. To which is John referring? I think he's doing both. I think he's bringing these ideas together. And that's not the only time John's going to do this sort of thing, where he'll say something that can be taken two different ways. And you say, well, which one is true? And John would smile and he would say, yes, because they're both true. Well, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So notice the Word was with God. And at the same time, we find out in this third line, the Word was God. So how can you be both with God and yet being God? Notice both of these, the first statement, when you say the Word was with God, that's something that's distinct. One person or thing is with another. But then when you say the Word was God, that's saying that they are the same. And so you have a bit of a mystery here. And instead of trying to unravel the mystery, sometimes it's good for us to just let the mystery be a little mysterious. This one that was in the beginning with God, that was with God, was at the same time, in some way, shape, or fashion, he was God. Now, notice it doesn't say he was a God. There is no indefinite article in the Greek, so, but you can still get that idea across. And this doesn't do that. It's telling us that God was what this thing was, and that's actually the emphasis of the order of the Greek words, or like that. It's telling us who He is, and we haven't gotten to the point where it's a He yet. We're going to see that, but we're not there yet. Verse 3. Now we do see the He. All things came into being through, and here you have the Greek word autos. So it is through Him. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So you have in verses 1 and 2, the one that we're going to find out is Jesus, that this Word was present at the beginning, and it tells us who He is, and the Word was God. And now in verse 3, again, this very Hebraic idea of God speaking the world into existence, that it's the one that we're going to find out is Jesus when we get to verse 14. He's responsible for the beginning. And so notice verses 1 and 2 tell us who He is. Verse 3 tells us what He did. And that's right out of the Old Testament. Psalm 33, verse 6, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of His mouth all their hosts. And notice when Psalms does that, it's giving it to us in parallel. And that sort of parallel, what you do is you say it, and then you say the same thing with different words. So the word of the Lord is the same thing as the breath of His mouth. Notice the heavens, their hosts, and the first part says, they were made, and you don't repeat that, but it's understood that crosses over by the breath of His mouth and all their hosts. They were made as well. And so that sort of parallelism is very, very Hebraic. It's seen in the Old Testament. But now we see the same thing said of this one who is the Word, that all things came into being through Him. All things began to exist through Him. And then notice, it says it in the positive, and then it says the same thing in the negative, and apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In other words, there's no exceptions to that. All things refer to all things, that they came into being through Him. This one is the Creator. Verse 4, in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And then picking up that light idea, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So that life idea, but the life was the light of men. So life, we don't always equate life and light, but we do here. So that life was in Him, and by making people alive, He also enlightened them. So He gave them both life and light. But notice verse 5, that light shines in the darkness. When if you take light away, that there's just darkness. And so in this case, you have light, but the light didn't do away with the darkness. Again, it reminds you a little bit of back in Genesis 1, where God said, let there be light, but then he divided between the light and the darkness. Here the light shines in the darkness. There's not a division from it, but rather the light shines in the darkness. So you've got life, and it leads to light, but then the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And for the term there, the NIV renders as the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You say, well, that's different than comprehend it. And that's because this is another term. Kata lambano is the basic Greek word. The lambano means to take, and kata is a prefix, means down. So to take down. You say, well, that sounds like the NIV has not taken it down, has not overcome it. Well, not entirely, because if you're listening to this video, you're probably trying to learn some lessons, and you're trying to get down the lessons that I'm giving you. A student, studies so that he can master, so that he can get down that information. And so notice that get down idea, it can have one of two ideas. It can have a comprehension idea, or it can have an overcoming idea to pull it down. And the same word can have two different ideas. You say, well, which one is true? Is it that the darkness was trying to understand the light and couldn't do it? Or was it that the darkness was trying to overcome and pull down the light, but it couldn't do it? And I think John would smile at us and say, yes, that they're both true. They're both true. And the New English Translation tries to capture both ideas by saying, and the light shines on in the darkness, but the darkness has not mastered it. You notice, to master something, that can be trying to understand it, and I finally mastered that idea, or to put itself over and to pull it down and to master it in such a way. So again, I think they've tried to capture both ideas. Now, I've already noted that Genesis 1 and John 1 have a lot of similarities. They begin with the beginning, where in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and we saw in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But also, in Genesis 1:2, remember, you have the Spirit of God was moving on the face of the waters. And here we see in him was life. Something was happening. And then God had said in Genesis 1:3, God said, let there be light. And here we see that same idea. The light was the life of men. And then God had separated the light from the darkness, but now we see the light shining in the darkness, and the darkness was not able to master it, to understand it, to pull it down, but they are there together. Verse 6, now we come to the second section, and there's almost a change of pace here, although we're still going to be talking about the one who is from the beginning and the one who is the light. There came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify. Notice these two words. He came as a witness to testify, and those are two English words that have the same meaning. They are synonyms. But in the Greek text, it's the same word, martyrios. So he came as a witness to witness, or he came as a testifier to testify. Either one works. But I'm going to keep it as two separate words because that's just better English, not better Greek. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not that light, but he came to testify about the light. So this one, John, isn't the light. He's not the light. He's not the one that was from the beginning, but he's coming to talk about that one. Verse 9, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. We just said that not everyone could master it, but here he does. There is a sense in which the one that comes into the world enlightens everyone. Not that they necessarily get it, but the light is shown. The light's still there. Verse 10, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. So the world, the cosmos, all that is, and world is a good translation of that. Notice the light came and shone in the world. And we already said the world was made through him. All things that were made, without him, nothing was made. And yet there was, even though he enlightens all people, the world didn't know him. And so there's both a light that's given and a light not received. And it gets more personal than that in verse 11. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. Now, you say, well, is that the world or is that something more specific? I would suggest this is something more specific. He came to his own, not just mankind, which were his own too, but he's going to come to his own people. He's going to come to his Jewish brothers. You see, Jesus was Jewish. And so his people, the ones that had the scriptures, he came to them. And yet, they did not, as a general rule, and there were exceptions. The entire early church was an exception. The entire early church was Jewish. But still, the Jewish people, as a people, did not receive him. And so that's who, when we speak about his own, those who were his own did not receive him. Verse 12, but, and here's the exception, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. You say, isn't everyone a child of God? And the answer is, in a sense, they are. Paul speaks of this when he's in Athens in Acts chapter 17, that he has made all mankind, in a sense, his children, because he has brought all mankind about. But in a more strict sense, it's as many as receive him that he gives the right to become children of God. So in a more specific, in a more strict sense, not everyone is a child of God, but only those who have received him. Now, what does it mean to receive him? Well, he explains that in the next line, even to those who believe in his name. So the receiving is another way of describing the believing. Verse 13, who were born. This is going to be something that John develops further when we get to John chapter 3. This sort of birth that's not just the natural birth, not a blood, not a birth of blood or of flesh, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor even of the will of man, but a birth that comes from God. And so that's the kind of birth that John's going to talk about. Actually, we'll see it coming from the lips of Jesus when we get to John chapter 3. But already it's been introduced here. And so there's a birth that's taken place that comes from God. Now, verse 14, here's what we've been waiting for, the identity of the Word, and it's understood when the Word became flesh. So we saw back in verse 1, in the beginning, the Word was something, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, already was. It already was God. The same was already in the beginning with God. But now the Word became something it was not previously. It became something. Yes, it was, but now it became something else. It became flesh. And now the Word is recognizable. You see, there was a time when the one who, can I say it this way, who became known as Jesus, the one who became flesh, wasn't flesh. But he was still there. But he wasn't flesh yet. So the Word became that which was not, became flesh, and dwelt among us. Now, I have to unpack that term because you could have said, and he lived, but this isn't the word to live. He dwelt among us. And now we're going to get a little bit specific as to the Greek text, es kenosen. And that term, notice that little, looks like an E in front, an epsilon. That's letting you know, plus the fact that it has a signal later on, that this is an aorist tense. Now, an aorist tense, in English, we have past, present, future. They have that in Greek, but they have a few more extra. And so we had what I call the imperfect one in the beginning already was something. But now this becomes something, and so the aorist is just the tense of simple action in the past, usually in the past. You can have what's called a historic. You can have a situation where the aorist is used of something that's happening right now, but usually it's in the past. Simple past action, and that's what we have here. He dwelt among us. That word dwelt. The basic word is skenao. Um, and yes, it can have the idea to live somewhere, but actually, it comes from the Greek word skene, which is the word for tent. So if I can press this just a little bit, now it can have, the translation "he dwelt among us" is not a bad translation. But if I can press this a little bit, I could say maybe that he tabernacled or he tented among us. And so I'm going to take that liberty, and I'm doing that. I want to recognize that. Because to our Jewish reader, he might say, well, there was a time when God tented with us in the past, where God actually dwelt in a tent. The tabernacle was all about that. And there's a sense in which what God did in the past by tabernacling with us in the past, that God does that again in the person of Jesus, who, as he took on flesh, tabernacled. He was the one tabernacling um, and dwelling in a tent with us. And notice when the tabernacle took place, this is why I think I can do this, because of the rest of the description. And we saw his glory. Remember what happened in the tabernacle? When God showed up in the tabernacle, God's glory, the glory cloud came. And here we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we saw his glory, that connects us to that tabernacle idea. And yet notice it's glory as of that's full of grace and truth. Grace is that which is freely received. Grace bestows a gift, but then it's also truth. And those two words don't always go together. You can have truth that, well, let me just say, you can have truth that's not necessarily a gift. And you can have I guess you could have a gift that's not all about the truth. But here, both of those are connected. In fact, they're going to be connected when we get to verse 17, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So let's wait for there. Verse 15, God testified, not God, John, we're back to John again. John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me." Now, we haven't even gotten to talk, like John in a historical sense. This is all part of the prologue, but we're going to see in a minute where John's testimony will be repeated. It's going to be given. But notice what John says. He comes after me. Now, we know when we look at Luke's account that gives us the birth narrative of both John and Jesus, that John the Baptist was conceived first and he was born first. And so there's a sense in which Jesus came after John, and yet, notice John says, he has a higher rank than me because he existed before me. And so Luke points that out, but also John points that out. Maybe assuming a bit that you're familiar with Luke's story. You see, I think perhaps John is the last of the gospel writers to write, and that he knows you may have either heard or even read some of those earlier gospel accounts. Verse 16, "For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace." Now, we're going to talk about truth again, but notice we're focusing not truth upon truth, but grace upon grace. that as we receive from God, it is a gift that we are receiving. That's what the word grace means. Um, when you are given a gift, in fact, the Greek terms actually are joined at the hip. They actually sound alike. Um, grace upon grace, for the law was given through Moses, and here we are back to grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. The law had truth in it, but grace was not the general characteristic of the law. The law brought a duty, whereas grace brings a free gift. And so we finally come to verse 18. We sum it all up. No one has seen God at any time. That's sort of a basic truth about God. He is the invisible God. He is the unseeable. So no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who's in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Now, the King James Version actually has a different reading, and it's not that they translated it differently. They're actually working from a different Greek text. Notice the King James says, no man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which we're used to reading in John's Gospel and other places about the only begotten Son. The only begotten God sounds sort of strange to us. And yet some of the oldest Greek manuscripts say it that way, which brings us to the question, is this the only begotten Son or the only begotten God? The later manuscripts from which the King James was translated, it reads the only begotten Huios, the only begotten Son, instead of the only begotten Theos. Notice how those terms even sound alike in Greek. The only begotten God. Which is it? I'm not sure. But like I said, the older manuscripts read it that way, the only begotten God, and yet that's speaking of Jesus. You say, well, is that a strange way to describe Jesus? Well, not in light of chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so this only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. That's what a word does. A word explains. And Jesus came to do that. Because no one has seen God at any time, he came so that we might get God, so that we might understand God, so that God might be communicated to us. So the only begotten God, the only begotten Son, I'm not sure how the Greek text had it. Like I said, we have it written both ways. The earlier manuscripts do read the only begotten God, so they might be right. But notice who is in the bosom of the Father. Not who was, but who is there today. So John alludes both to the beginning, but not to the end, but to the today. And that's where John's going to take us. It's a present participle, so I could actually render that the only begotten Son, God, whichever it is, being in the bosom of the Father, but it's present tense. And he has explained him. He has declared him. He has declared and manifested who and what God is. Now, I said I was going to give you a more extended outline. Here it is. Back in verses 1 and 2, we saw the Word that was from the beginning, that the one was with God, and he was God. And then his role in creation in verse 3, all things came into being through him. And then the gift that was given to men in him was life, and the life was the light of men. So we have both light and life mentioned there. We have the witness of John the Baptist mentioned in verses 6 through 8. The Word coming into the world, and the pivotal point, verses 12 and 13, in order that we might become children of God. And then that Word became flesh. That was verse 14, and dwelt among us. So notice the Word coming into the world, and now it becomes flesh. and dwelt among us. So a further description of that. We had the witness of John the Baptist in verses 6 through 8. Again, we have the witness of John the Baptist in verse 15. Notice how this whole section is sort of given to us in parallel. We have the gift to men were light and life, and now again the gift to men of his fullness we have received grace and truth. We had his role in creation, and now his role in bringing that grace and truth, verse 17. And we come full circle. The Word was with God, and now we find out that he is in the bosom of the Father.